In the silent depths of Hollywood's backstage, a clash of titans unfolded, not with shouts, but with the quiet of an unshakable conviction. On one side, Jerry Lewis, the architect of classic comedy, guardian of a golden era. On the other, Eddie Murphy, the giant of modern laughter, master of a new frontier for humor. It was 1996, and the shadow of commercial success was cast over Lewis's legacy. The scene was a private encounter, far from the spotlight and the red carpets, a moment when Murphy's personal admiration brutally collided with Lewis's uncompromising defense of the soul of his most vulnerable creation, the Nutty Professor. What was at stake was not just a cinematic critique, but a philosophical battle over the essence of laughter and the price of innocence in art. The conversation would be remembered not for the offense, but for the depth of Lewis's motive. The atmosphere of this meeting carried the weight of history. The air in a luxurious, climate-controlled, and stuffy dressing room seemed heavier under the tungsten lights, while the aroma of cigar and theatrical makeup lingered in the environment. The only sound was the contained murmur of their voices, a contrast to the explosion of laughter both provoked on movie screens. For Lewis, the walls of that room were more than a setting. They were the courtroom where the integrity of his character, Professor Julius Kelp, would be judged. The object of contention, the chemical formula that transformed the timid man into the seductive Buddy Love, was not just a prop, but the exact symbol of the moral transformation Lewis felt had been perverted in the remake. This formula, for Lewis, was sacred, and he was there to defend its purity. Before we follow on, if you want more powerful stories like this one, comment your opinion below, leave your like, and subscribe to the channel. This helps us continue bringing intense accounts about integrity and the behind-the-scenes of cinema. To understand the force of Jerry Lewis's criticism, one must first go back to 1963, the year the classic original comedy The Nutty Professor hit theaters, establishing a new paradigm for the genre. Lewis, already an iconic figure from his partnership with Dean Martin, used the film not just as a vehicle for physical comedy, but as a deep psychological exploration of inadequacy and the desire for acceptance. His character, the scientist Julius Kelp, was the very incarnation of human vulnerability. Clumsy, squeaky-voiced, completely unable to deal with the social world, yet possessing a pure soul. The humor was born from empathy and Kelp's pain in desperately trying to fit in, and the magic potion that transformed him into Buddy Love was a dangerous shortcut, a superficial escape that, Lewis insisted, should never be romanticized. The social setting of the time, the transition from the innocence of the 50s to the turbulence of the 60s, reinforced Lewis's message. True beauty and strength resided in accepting one's own flaws, not in creating a false and arrogant persona. The original film, with its vibrant color palette but melancholic subtext, used science fiction as a moral mirror. Lewis directed and starred, infusing Kelp with concrete details of his own youth, stage fright, insecurity, the desire to be seen beyond the physical comedian. The performance was not a farce, but an act of brutally honest self-exposure, which gave the film an emotional resonance that distinguished it from any other comedy of its time and cemented its place as a revered classic. Decades later, the landscape of laughter had changed drastically. Eddie Murphy, who emerged in the 80s as a force of nature in comedy, was the legitimate heir to the throne, but with a crown forged in bolder, more direct, and at times, vulgar humor, in contrast to Lewis's vaudeville charm. When Murphy decided to revisit the story in 1996, the proposal was clear: modernize the premise for a new generation that appreciated cynicism and explicit physical humor. The success was resounding, with the film grossing astronomical sums and consolidating Murphy as a master of transformation, playing multiple characters through prosthetics and makeup, an indirect tribute, perhaps, to the versatility Lewis had already demonstrated. However, the commercial success of Murphy's remake, a triumph of technique and satire, began to create a fissure in the original's legacy. For Lewis, the 1996 version, although technically impressive, had made an unacceptable exchange. It replaced Kelp's vulnerable heart with more immediate and, in his view, shallow humor, focused on crude jokes and physical exaggeration for the sake of exaggeration. Kelp's creation, the purple and bubbling formula, which in the original was the tragedy of a desperate man, and the remake seemed to have become merely a narrative device for the joke. Lewis's emotional state, observing this from afar, was one of profound frustration, feeling that the moral message he had carefully stitched into the fabric of his film had been, if not ignored, at least relegated to the background. The inciting incident, the inevitable rupture of equilibrium, occurred not at the time of the remake's release, but in its overwhelming and undeniable popularity. Eddie Murphy's The Nutty Professor, unlike being a simple homage, became, in public perception, the definitive version of the story, eclipsing the memory of the original film for a new generation of viewers. This threat to the legacy, the idea that the depth and vulnerability of the 1963 film would be forgotten in favor of the 1996 spectacle, ignited an alarm in Jerry Lewis's mind, transforming his silent disapproval into a moral necessity for intervention. He understood that the battle was not for copyrights or box office, but for the preservation of the meaning he had deposited in Kelp. The noticeable shift occurred when the inevitable interviews and behind-the-scenes reports about the remake began to circulate, often addressing Lewis's reaction with a mixed expectation of reverence and skepticism. Lewis, initially, tried to maintain professional courtesy, praising Murphy's undeniable talent and the technical prowess of the makeup. However, his body language and the prolonged pauses before responding exposed his latent dissatisfaction. He could not articulate the criticism superficially. He needed to reach the essence, the sacrifice of purity he felt had been made at the altar of easier and commercially guaranteed laughter. The weight of being the guardian of an icon began to press upon him. The point of no return was reached when fate, or perhaps an imprudent public relations agent, united the two comedians at the same event. Murphy, in his genuine reverence for Lewis, sought the master's approval, creating the perfect stage for the confrontation. He approached Lewis with the respect of a student before a teacher, eager to receive the stamp of approval for his modernization. This moment, charged with a silent and awkward tension, was the trigger. Lewis could no longer offer half-truths or polite evasions. Murphy's success demanded an honest answer about the film's heart. The tension reached a peak when Lewis stood up, walked to the window, and looked at the Hollywood skyline, the place where art and commerce collided daily. He emphasized that the universal message of his film, "You are enough as you are," had been adulterated. Lewis's critique was a moral micro-cliffhanger, forcing Murphy to process that the master was not rejecting him, but rejecting the lack of heart he perceived in the adaptation. The symbolism of the chemical formula came back up. Lewis said that Kelp, in the end, destroyed the formula to choose himself. He asked Murphy, "Did your Kelp make the same moral choice with the same urgency and despair?" The implication was that, in the remake, the destruction of the formula seemed less like a redemption and more like a convenient conclusion to the story, without the depth of personal sacrifice. The ambiguity of the encounter resided in the fact that Lewis was being brutally honest out of respect. He respected Murphy enough to give him the truth, instead of an empty compliment. He wanted Murphy, the artist, to understand the higher mission that Lewis felt the comedian had betrayed. Lewis, turning back to Murphy, ended this series of micro-scenes with the cold realization that the remake was a spectacle of makeup and talent, but not a story of soul. What followed was not the end of the conversation, but the start of the true dramatic escalation, where Lewis would finally reveal the exact quote that would seal the legacy of his critique. The dramatic escalation began with the moral urgency imposed by Lewis. He had established the crucial difference: psychological vulnerability versus situational comedy. Murphy, visibly uncomfortable, tried to argue about the timing of the comedy, about how the 1996 audience needed a faster pace and more direct gags, characteristics he considered essential for the box office success that Lewis was ignoring. The emotional weight grew with every word, as Lewis felt that Murphy was defending commerce over art, and he could not accept that. Lewis, with a choked but controlled voice, pulled the conversation to the theme of injustice. He felt there was a fundamental injustice in the way the new version treated Julius Kelp. The original Kelp was worthy of pity, but never of derision. Lewis saw the emotional pressure on Kelp in the remake as something excessively cartoonish, a character built to be purely ridiculed before his transformation. The injustice, for Lewis, was the removal of the misfit's dignity, transforming his quest for acceptance into a cruel joke. distorting the original purpose of the story. The revelation began to take shape when Lewis referred to his own creative process. He explained to Murphy that, in creating the Nutty Professor in 1963, he was in fact making a personal sacrifice, exposing his own fragility under the light of cinema so that others would feel less alone. The emotional connection he forged with the audience through Kelp's pain was, for Lewis, the true gold of the film. He felt that Murphy's version did not have the same courage to expose himself, preferring the mask of makeup and cynicism to the emotional nudity that he had dared to show. Murphy, feeling cornered, defended the creative freedom of an adapter and the right to reinvent. However, Lewis countered this defense with a phrase that raised attention. "You can remake the story, but you don't have the right to steal the soul." The urgency became palpable. Lewis was not only criticizing, but pleading for the preservation of an ideal. He saw the emotional pressure on the artist to be commercial as the new buddy love, a seductive force that promised success in exchange for integrity. The build-up to the culmination was the link between Kelp's formula and the moral of the story. Lewis observed to Murphy that the 1963 love was an alcoholic, an addict to his own temporary beauty and power. The substance that created him was intrinsically destructive. The removal of this dark morality in the remake was the fatal error, the point where the story ceased to be a moral tragedy disguised as a comedy and became merely a comedy of multiple personas. Murphy's expectation was clear. He needed an unassailable justification for Lewis's dissatisfaction. Lewis concluded this phase with a definitive sentence about what he most regretted. It was not the money, nor the special effects, but the loss of the protagonist's humanity. He said that the new film had transformed the journey of self-acceptance into a narrative of revenge, where the misfit, instead of learning to love himself, merely found a funnier way to punish those who despised him. This distortion of the emotional core was the final betrayal, the philosophical motive that Lewis was finally ready to deliver in its most potent and unforgettable form. The climax of the tension occurred when Jerry Lewis, ignoring the commercial brilliance of the remake and the intimidating presence of Eddie Murphy, uttered his criticism in its purest and most disarming form. He looked at Murphy and, with a clarity that cut the air, finally revealed the exact point that had deeply disappointed him in the 1996 film. It was not about the makeup, which he recognized as masterful, nor Murphy's performance, which he classified as talented, but rather the character's motivation. In my movie, Julius Kelp hated himself. He transformed into Buddy Love to try to love himself. In your movie, he simply seemed to want revenge. This was the most important symbolic gesture, the defense of vulnerability over aggression. Lewis continued, explaining that the 1963 Nutty Professor was a comedy disguised as a tragedy about self-image. The magic potion was the temptation of social suicide, destroying oneself to create something acceptable. The great turning point, the emotional payoff he advocated for, was Kelp's final choice to embrace his inadequacy. Lewis felt that the remake had lost this moral backbone, this authentic pain that made the laughter, in the end, redemptive and meaningful. Murphy, habitually a master of reply and performance, remained in absolute silence. He had no argument against the emotional integrity Lewis was defending. The criticism was not an attack on his comedy, but on the heart of the story. Lewis had transformed the confrontation from which film is better to which film has soul. In that moment, Lewis's unwavering posture, his dedication to a message of innocence and vulnerability, elevated him from comedian to a moral philosopher of cinema. It was in this crucial instant that Lewis made the conscious decision not to attack Murphy personally or professionally, but to criticize the central narrative choice. The inciting incident was not the film's release, but Lewis's courage in confronting modernity and the commercialization of laughter, looking into the eyes of the man who represented it. His criticism would be filtered through artistic frustration, moved by the pain of seeing Kelp, his vulnerable alter ego, transformed into a mere caricature seeking revenge and not redemption. The conversation that followed would not be an exchange of pleasantries, but the imposition of an ethical and emotional standard that Eddie Murphy never expected to exist behind the curtain of laughter. Lewis was sitting in his armchair in the dressing room, his hands firmly intertwined, a gesture that betrayed his anxiety behind a facade of composure. He had watched the remake's trailer countless times, and each viewing reinforced his pain. Eddie Murphy's Kelp, while hilarious, seemed intentionally stripped of innocence. In the 1963 original, Kelp was a misfit. In the new 1996 film, he seemed almost pathetic, an easier target for mockery. Lewis lamented that the audience would not be laughing with him, but only at him, and this distinction was the impassable ethical line that separated the two works. The first micro scene of the confrontation was not an explosion, but an exchange of charged courtesies. Eddie Murphy began by expressing his longtime admiration, citing iconic scenes from the original The Nutty Professor, like the dinner with Kelp's parents. He tried to build a bridge of respect, believing that reverence would be enough to get the blessing. Lewis smiled, an old and tired smile, and accepted the tribute. But his blue eyes, once full of comedic mischief, now carried the weight of a watchful sentry. That moment of peace was the calm before the storm of truth. Lewis, in a surprisingly low and thoughtful tone, deflected the conversation toward Kelp's purpose. He mentioned the laboratory, that sanctuary of failed inventions and naive hope. For Lewis, Kelp's potion was a symbol of his hopelessness, the last resort of a good man who could not be loved for who he really was. He described Kelp in vivid detail, focusing not on his tics, but on his intrinsic fragility. It was Lewis's introspection, an attempt to force Murphy to see the 1963 Kelp beyond the surface of the jokes. Murphy listened, initially confused. He had focused on the physical transformation and the comedic contrast between Kelp and Buddy Love. His focus was on the technique, the prosthetics, the voices, the social satire. For him, the remake was a technical advance and a comedy success. Doubt began to appear on his face. Had he missed the main point? He had not realized that Lewis's humor was a byproduct of a deeply human drama. The silence between them, punctuated only by the distant hum of the air conditioning, was the first crack in Murphy's armor. Lewis, perceiving the impact, intensified the focus on the moral contrast. He described Buddy Love, Kelp's alter ego, as evil disguised as cool. In the original film, Love was dangerous, destructive, and more importantly, hated by Kelp in the end. He was the opposite of Kelp's naive goodness. Lewis felt that the 1996 Buddy Love had been softened, becoming merely a channel for Murphy's ego and comedy, losing its demonic nature and its function as a moral mirror of society. The narrative then cut to the symbolic object, the small glass bottle that contained a formula, seen in flashbacks as a sacred relic. Lewis explained that the original Kelp was deeply ashamed of Buddy Love, and the destruction of the formula at the climax was an act of self-salvation and acceptance. Lewis's internal conflict was clear. The remake seemed to celebrate Love instead of condemning him, transforming Kelp's redemption into a prolonged joke about the liberation of his wild side. Murphy, sensing the seriousness of the moment, tried to defend the remake's choices, mentioning that the modern audience demanded more transgressive humor and that the comedic timing had been adjusted for the sensibilities of the era. He appealed to the commercial argument. The film was working, people were laughing, the money was coming in. This was the tense transition in the micro scene. For Lewis, commercial success was irrelevant. Lewis responded with a subtle and devastating analogy. He compared the act of taking the innocence out of Kelp to the act of removing the melody from music and leaving only the beat. The beat was strong and popular, but the melody, the vulnerable soul of the character, was what made the work art. He used the word sweet to describe Kelp, emphasizing the naive purity that, in his opinion, had been sacrificed in the name of a more cynical and less emotionally risky humor. I want to know your opinion on this moment. Comment what you would do in this situation. Defend the original work or accept commercial modernization. Lewis then leaned in, his voice almost a whisper, but charged with authority. He spoke about Kelp's fear. The fear of failure, of being ridiculed, of not being loved. That fear was the foundation of the original. When the remake transformed Kelp into an almost caricature and exaggerated figure from the beginning, Lewis felt that the fear, and consequently the empathy, was stolen. The audience could not identify with the pain of the 1963 Kelp if he were just a walking punchline. There was a moment of realization on Murphy's face. He realized that Lewis was not criticizing the acting or the script, but the moral subtext of the story he had tried to tell. The criticism was existential, not technical. Lewis was fighting so that the original's message of self-acceptance would not be buried under layers of visual gags and bathroom jokes, prominent features of the 1996 film. Lewis continued, exploring the ambiguity of the love character in the original. Buddy Love was not just a heartthrob. He was a sociopath, the liberation of Kelp's worst instincts. The audience, in the original, should feel revulsion for love, not admiration. Lewis felt that Murphy's love was, in essence, the hero of the comedy, which inverted the moral lesson he had tried to convey from 1963 onward. Lewis's introspection deepened. He revealed to Murphy that Kelp was, in many aspects, a disguised self-portrait. That film was Lewis confronting his own insecurities, using ridicule as catharsis. Seeing his catharsis transformed into mass entertainment without the same emotional charge was like seeing an intimate diary being used to wrap fish. Murphy's shock was evident. Lewis touched on the issue of honor. He told Murphy that, for him, comedy was not just about making people laugh. It was about telling the truth about human pain in a palatable way. He used the term raw vulnerability to describe what was missing in the remake. It was Kelp's fragility, not his fatness or his clumsiness, that Lewis was passionately defending, raising the level of discussion from a film critique to a debate about art. Murphy, now genuinely shaken, tried to argue that his Kelp also had vulnerability, that the remake spoke about the pressure of body image in modern society. However, Lewis countered incisively, saying that Murphy's vulnerability was superficial, an external problem, the body, while Kelp's vulnerability was psychological, an internal problem, the soul. The climax ended with the weight of Lewis's conviction hanging in the air. He had told the truth, the painful truth of an artist who saw his work being reinterpreted without its essential subtext. The emotional reward for the audience, upon hearing this, was the profound respect for Lewis's refusal to compromise the integrity of his legacy in exchange for empty praise for a commercial success. He was, until the end, defending the misfit, the shy one, the original Kelp against the cynicism of a new era. The direct consequences of the climax were notable, marked by a subtle, but definitive, change in the dynamic between the two artists. Eddie Murphy, a man accustomed to dominating any room, absorbed Lewis's criticism with unexpected humility. He did not defend himself, he reflected. Lewis's brutal honesty did not offend him, but disarmed him, as he recognized the passion and depth of an artist who saw his work not as mere entertainment, but as a moral statement. This tacit acceptance of Lewis's criticism was the first alteration in the environment, transforming tension into mutual respect. Although Lewis never formally changed his opinion about the 1996 remake, the outcome of the relationship was not one of enmity, but of a consolidated respect for Lewis's integrity. Murphy began to cite Lewis in interviews with a new layer of consideration, understanding that the criticism was not personal, but doctrinal. Lewis had used the encounter to teach a timeless lesson. Commercial success is ephemeral, but the emotional truth of a work of art is its eternal legacy. The audience, upon learning of the criticism, was forced to reevaluate the remake through the lens of lost vulnerability. The emotional closure conveyed a profound meaning about humanity and cinema. Lewis, in defending Kelp, defended all misfits. His posture reaffirmed the value of comedy with heart, the one that laughs with the pain, but does not mock it. The final resolution was not in Murphy agreeing with Lewis, but in understanding what Lewis had stood for. That true art demands that the artist not only entertain, but serve the soul of his creation, keeping vulnerability intact. Kelp's purity was saved, at least in the memory of the creator. Jerry Lewis's legacy, encapsulated in that exchange of words, transcended the boundaries of comedy to consolidate itself as a testament to artistic integrity. He taught us that, in a world obsessed with superficial transformations and quick successes, true courage lies in defending the fragile, the imperfect, the one that is hardest to love, both in ourselves and in our creations. Humor can be the shell, but vulnerability is the non-negotiable core that prevents a work from becoming empty. His refusal to compromise the soul of Julius Kelp was, ultimately, a declaration of love for humanity. The story unfolds as a powerful meditation on the cost of modernization. How much is success worth if it requires the story to sacrifice its essence? its original message of unconditional self-acceptance. The confrontation between Lewis and Murphy was not about who was the funnier comedian, but about what was the moral price of making people laugh. What does this reveal about character and difficult choices? And how much of our own inner fragility are we willing to negotiate in search of outward acceptance and success? And in your opinion, what does this reveal about character and difficult choices? Leave your comment.